Selene Briarvale wasn't afraid of death. What terrified her was the wrongness, the cold certainty that the ancient horn had sounded her name instead of Alara's. Her younger sister. Sweet, delicate Alara, who had just turned 18. The perfect age. The prophesied age. The blood moon call shattered the twilight like a scream through silk. This was meant to be Alara's nightmare, not hers. Selene had made her choice in a heartbeat. She would go. She would survive. And she would end the monster who wore a crown. Blackfang Castle rose from the mountain like a fong piercing the sky, all obsidian stone and towers that swallowed light. She was dragged not into a dungeon, but into a throne room that stretched like the throat of some massive beast. And at the end sat King Aladorian Blackfang. He was not the monster she'd imagined. He was devastatingly, cruelly beautiful in the way a winter storm was beautiful, cold, remote, utterly indifferent to destruction. His eyes were the color of blood on snow, fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch not in fear, but in fury. Selene Briarvale. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. The records indicated Alara Briarvale. You are not her. No, she said, stronger than she felt. I'm not. Then why are you here? Because the call was wrong. Because your cursed ritual would have taken an innocent girl. Because I chose to come in her place. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. You chose, he repeated. How unexpected. A priestess emerged, carrying a chalice and a blade of frozen moonlight. The blood moon rises, she intoned. The binding must be completed. Where in the world are you reading this from? Drop your location in the comments and hit subscribe to see Selene's next move against the Vampire King. Before Selene could react, the blade flashed across her palm. Pain. Blood welling dark and vital. Aladorian extended his own hand without hesitation. The priestess sliced his palm, pressing their bleeding hands together. By blood and moon, by shadow and bone. The world exploded into sensation, lightning and ice simultaneously. Selene felt her life force pulled from her chest through invisible threads, tangling with something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. In that forced intimacy, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on a soul that had forgotten rest, the exhaustion of an immortal trapped in amber, unchanging and alone. When released, Selene staggered back. The cut had sealed, leaving a thin silver scar that pulsed with faint light. The bond is set, the priestess announced. Until the next blood moon, your lives are tethered. Should one die, the other follows within 3 days. Perfect, Selene said through gritted teeth. Trapped with a murderer. Murderer. Aladorian examined the word. His blood-red eyes fixed on her with something dangerous. Curiosity. You have made many assumptions, Selene Briarvale. I wonder how many are built on truth, and how many on stories frightened villagers tell children. I know what you've done. 23 girls. 23 brides called here, none returned. And what am I? A monster. Impossibly, his mouth curved. Good. Fear will keep you cautious. Hatred will keep you sharp. You will need both ahead. He turned toward his throne. Take her to the East Tower. Give her access to the library. My lord. A guard sounded confused. Aladorian glanced back. If you truly wish to kill me, little bride, you should understand what you're trying to destroy. Read, Selene. Learn your enemy before you attempt to end him. 3 nights later, Selene made her move. She'd found a vial from a hedge which, 3 drops, would paralyze even an immortal. The bond prevented outright murder, but paralysis wasn't death. She could dose him, find the source of his power, destroy it. When he died, she'd have 3 days to break the bond. The king had requested her presence for dinner in the private solar. Perfect. The room was intimate, warm. A table set for 2. Aladorian stood by the window. You came, he said without turning. Did I have a choice? There is always a choice, Selene. That is what makes you fascinating. On the table, 2 goblets of wine. She sat, heart hammering. As Aladorian reached for his goblet, She fumbled hers deliberately. His attention flickered. The vial slid into her palm. "Tell me," she kept her voice steady, "if you're such an unwilling participant, why haven't any brides come home?" Pain flashed across his face. "Because they made the same choice you did. They chose to come. And they chose to stay." "I don't believe you." "I know." He lifted his goblet. "That is why I asked you to read. But I see you came tonight to kill me." Selene froze. "Go ahead," he said softly. "I can see the vial, smell the paralytic. Clever. Non-lethal, so the bond won't drag you down immediately. Why aren't you stopping me?" "Because I am tired, Selene. So very tired. But before you act, have you considered what happens to this kingdom if I die before teaching you what I guard against?" "You're lying. Look at me. Use the bond. Feel what I feel. Then decide." Against her will, she reached across the tether. What she felt stole her breath. Not triumph or cruelty. Only exhaustion. Loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. And underneath, unshakable resolve, a man who had sacrificed everything for a purpose he could never abandon. The vial slipped from her fingers, shattering. "Why didn't you stop me?" she whispered. "Because you needed to make the choice yourself. Free will is the only thing with power against what's coming." He stood. "Do you truly believe a man can be vanquished by cheap tricks? If I were the monster you think, you'd be dead. But I am not your enemy." "Then what are you?" "A guardian. And now, so are you." He gestured toward the library. "Read. Please. Learn your enemy. But make sure you're aiming at the right enemy. You have full access now. When you're ready for the truth about the brides, about the Umbra, about why the blood moon call exists, find me in the courtyard at dawn." Selene read through the night. References to the Umbra appeared again and again, a primal shadow, a corruption bound by Blackfang blood. Each generation required renewal, a life freely given. The brides who chose. As dawn crept through the windows, Selene understood. She had broken the pattern by coming through defiant, willful choice. She closed the ancient book and made her decision. In the courtyard below, a dark figure waited. Selene touched the silver scar on her palm and stepped into the light. The courtyard was not what Selene expected. She had imagined opulence, perhaps gold and marble, the ostentatious display of a tyrant's wealth. Or darkness, a place of execution and torment where the screams of the vanished brides still echoed against stone. Instead, she found devastation. The eastern section of the courtyard had collapsed entirely, revealing a chasm so deep the bottom disappeared into absolute darkness. The stone around it looked diseased, blackened and crumbling as if touched by some corrosive force that ate away at reality itself. The air above the pit shimmered with a wrongness that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on it. And in the center of it all stood Aladorian. He had removed his formal cloak and stood in only a dark shirt and trousers, his sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms marked with symbols that seemed to move beneath his skin like living tattoos. His hands were extended toward the chasm, and from his palms poured something that was not quite light and not quite shadow, a silver-blue energy that writhed and coiled like smoke made solid. Selene stopped at the courtyard's edge, transfixed. The energy flowing from Aladorian wrapped around the broken stone, and where it touched, the corruption began to recede. Slowly, agonizingly, the blackened rock regained its natural color. The chasm shrank, inch by painful inch, as if an invisible hand were stitching reality back together from the inside out. But the cost was written clearly on Aladorian's face. Sweat beaded his brow despite the cold morning air. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. The symbols on his arms blazed brighter, and she realized with a start that they were burning him. She could smell scorched flesh, could see the thin wisps of smoke rising from his skin. He was in agony. And he didn't stop. Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, while the Vampire King poured what looked like his very essence into healing a wound in the earth itself. The chasm continued to close, the corruption continued to retreat, and Aladorian's legs began to shake with the effort of remaining standing. Finally, when the last of the blackened stone had returned to its natural gray, when the chasm had sealed to nothing more than a hairline crack in the courtyard floor, Aladorian lowered his hands. He swayed, caught himself, and slowly, so slowly it looked like every movement cost him, lowered himself to sit on the edge of a broken fountain. His head dropped forward, his breathing ragged, and for a long moment he simply existed in the aftermath of whatever he had just done. Selene found herself moving forward without conscious decision, drawn by a compulsion she didn't understand and couldn't resist. What was that? Her voice came out softer than intended. Aladorian didn't look up immediately. When he finally raised his head, his eyes had dulled from their usual vivid crimson to something closer to rust, and the sharp beauty of his features looked eroded, as if the act of healing had aged him decades in minutes. "The Umbra," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "It tests the boundaries constantly, looking for weakness. That chasm opened 3 days ago, the day you arrived and broke the pattern. It has been spreading 6 inches every hour since." He gestured at the now-sealed crack with a hand that trembled visibly. The symbols on his forearms had faded to faint scars, still angry and red. "This is what I do, Selene. Every day, every night. I find the places where the corruption breaks through, and I push it back. I mend with the Umbra tears. I hold the line." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a weariness that made her earlier glimpse through the bond seem like a shallow preview of an unfathomable depth. "I am not a destroyer," he said quietly. "I am a sentinel of what remains." Selene stared at the sealed crack, at the stones that now looked whole, but still bore the faint shadow stain of what had tried to consume them. She thought of the books she'd read through the night, the references to a corruption that had nearly devoured the realm. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been doing this?" 347 years, Aladorian said without hesitation. "Since the day I bound the Umbra to my bloodline and became its warden instead of its victim." He stood slowly, favoring his right leg, and Selene noticed for the first time that his hands were blistered and raw beneath the fading symbols. "The brides," he continued, anticipating her next question, "were not ornaments or victims. They were anchors. The Umbra feeds on life force, on the essence of living things. Each year, it requires a tribute to remain dormant, a single life, freely given, to satisfy its hunger so it doesn't wake fully and consume everything." The words hit her like physical blows. "You're saying they sacrificed themselves?" "Willingly." "I'm saying they were given the choice I was never given," Aladorian said, and there was no bitterness in his voice, only statement of fact. "They could return home and live their lives, or they could stay and give 1 year, just one, to hold back the darkness for everyone else. Every single one chose to stay." He began walking toward the castle, moving like a man decades older than he appeared. "Until you," he added, glancing back at her. "You didn't just choose to come, Selene. You came angry, defiant. Your will is stronger, your life force more vibrant, because you burn with purpose instead of resignation. And the Umbra felt it. It knows the pattern is broken." He paused at the doorway leading inside. "It's waking up." Selene followed Aladorian through corridors she had never seen before, descending deeper into the castle's heart. The air grew colder with each step, and the torches burned with that same sickly blue-green flame that seemed to illuminate without providing warmth. Finally, they reached a door carved from a single piece of black stone, covered in the same symbols that had burned on Aladorian's arms. He placed his palm against it, and the door swung open silently. Beyond was a chamber that stole the breath from Selene's lungs. It was a memorial. 23 alcoves lined the circular walls, each one containing a statue carved from pale marble. But these were not generic monuments, each face was unique, rendered in exquisite detail, capturing not just features but personality. A woman with laugh lines around her eyes. Another with a determined set to her jaw. A girl who looked barely older than Alara, with flowers woven into her stone hair. The brides. Their names are written beneath, Aladorian said quietly, moving to stand before the first statue. Alara Mu Whisper. She came 346 years ago, when I first found the Umbra. She was a scholar who understood what I was trying to do before I could fully explain it. He touched the statue's base with a reverence that bordered on worship. She chose to stay. To give 1 year of her life force to stabilize the binding. I begged her to reconsider. She refused. She said, his voice caught slightly, she said 1 year of her life to save thousands was the best trade she could imagine. Selene moved to the next alcove. Mira Thornheart, the plaque read. The statue showed a woman with warrior scars on her hands, captured mid-laugh. Mira was a mercenary, Aladorian continued, following her. She came expecting to fight her way out. Instead, she stayed because she finally found something worth protecting that couldn't be defended with a sword. He moved from statue to statue, and for each one, he had a story. Not of victims. Not of sacrifices torn unwilling from their lives. But of women who had seen the truth and made a choice. Selene felt something cracking inside her chest, the foundation of her certainty crumbling like the corrupted stone in the courtyard. You're saying none of them were murdered? I'm saying I gave them the truth and the choice. Aladorian's voice was steady, but his eyes held centuries of grief. The Umbra requires a life essence each year to remain dormant. Without it, it wakes, and when it wakes fully, it consumes everything, not just this kingdom, but the realm beyond. The bride can offer 1 year, which weakens them but doesn't kill them, and then return home. Or... He stopped before the most recent statue, a woman with kind eyes and healer's hands. Or they can offer everything at once. Their entire life force in a single moment, which creates a stronger binding and buys more time before the next call is needed. The implications crashed over Selene like a wave. They all chose the second option, she whispered. Every single one. Aladorian's hand trembled as he touched the final statue's base. I offered them 1 year and freedom. They gave me everything because they understood what I was holding back. They chose the darkness to hold back the greater night. Selene's mind raced through everything she'd believed, every story she'd been told about the monster king who stole brides and drank them dry. The village tales. The whispered horrors. All of it wrong. All of it a misunderstanding of a sacrifice so profound it defied comprehension. The families, she said, her voice breaking. They grieved. They thought their daughters died from monster's appetite, Aladorian finished. And I let them believe it. Because the truth that their daughters chose to die protecting people who would never know their names, never honor their sacrifice, seemed crueler than letting me be the villain. He turned to face her fully, and the weight of 3 centuries of solitary burden was written in every line of his face. The brides did not die for me, Selene. They died protecting the kingdom from an ancient terror. From the Umbra. And each one understood that their sacrifice would be forgotten, twisted into a horror story, because the greatest acts of heroism are the ones that prevent disasters no one ever knows were coming. Selene looked around the chamber at 23 faces frozen in marble, 23 women who had walked into darkness willingly so others could live in light, and felt tears burning hot tracks down her cheeks. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why let yourself be hated when you could have? Because fear keeps people away from this castle, Aladorian said simply. Fear keeps them from accidentally weakening the barriers I've built. Fear is a kindness compared to the truth that their safety requires someone to die every year, and that someone has to choose it freely. He moved toward the chamber's exit, his footsteps echoing in the sacred silence. You broke the pattern by coming with defiance instead of resignation, with fury instead of fear. Your life force burns differently. Brighter. and the Umbra has tasted it through our bond. He paused at the threshold, his silhouette dark against the corridor's sickly light. It wants you, Selene. Not as a bride. As a feast. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to stop it from taking you. What do you think happens when the Umbra comes for Selene? Drop your predictions in the comments below and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The burning in Selene's palm intensified over the following days, spreading up her arm in thin silver veins that pulsed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. She found Oladorian in the library 3 nights after visiting the Chamber of Brides, surrounded by ancient texts, his face drawn and haggard in the candlelight. "It's getting worse," she said, holding up her arm. The silver veins now reached past her elbow, branching like lightning frozen beneath flesh. Oladorian looked up, and the defeat in his eyes was more terrifying than any monster could be. "Sit," he said quietly. "It's time you understood what you've truly become part of." Selene sat across from him, cradling her burning arm against her chest. Outside the windows, storm clouds gathered despite the clear forecast, and the air tasted of copper and ash. "The brides were not just sacrifices," Oladorian began, his voice heavy with the weight of confession. "They were containment mechanisms. Living seals. Each one offered their life essence not simply to feed the Umbra's hunger, but to reinforce the binding that keeps it imprisoned within my bloodline." He pushed one of the ancient texts toward her, its pages covered in diagrams that showed a human figure surrounded by concentric circles of symbols. "The Umbra is not merely a curse, Selene. It is a sentient corruption, a primal force of shadow that existed before light, before life, before anything. My ancestor, the first Blackfang, managed to bind it using his own blood as a cage. But curses this powerful require constant reinforcement. They require fresh life essence, freely given, to maintain their integrity." The silver veins on Selene's arm pulsed brighter, and she gasped as pain lanced through her shoulder. "The pattern was specific," Oladorian continued, standing to pace. "Young women, aged 18 to 20, willing but resigned to their fate. Their life force had a particular quality, soft, accepting, easily woven into the existing barrier. For 347 years, the pattern held. Each bride's essence integrated seamlessly with the binding, strengthening it for another year." He stopped at the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "Then you came." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no lightning flashed. "You are 22. Older. Your life force is not soft or accepting, it burns with defiance, with fury, with the strength of what I haven't seen in centuries. When the binding ritual connected us, when your essence touched the barrier, it didn't integrate. It resisted." Selene felt ice crystallizing in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you shattered the pattern." Oladorian turned to face her, and she saw something she'd never seen in him before: fear. Your stronger, more determined soul didn't reinforce the containment. It disrupted it. The Umbra felt resistance for the first time in 3 centuries, felt a life force that refused to submit, and it. The library doors burst open. A servant stumbled in, his face ashen. "My lord, the West Tower." "It's..." Before he could finish, a sound tore through the castle that was not quite a scream, and not quite the groan of breaking stone. It was deeper, older, the sound of something vast stirring in depths that should have remained forever still. Oladorian was moving before the echo faded, Selene racing after him through corridors that suddenly felt too dark, too cold, as if all warmth were being drained toward a single point. They emerged onto the western battlement to find the sky above the tower roiling with darkness that moved against the wind, coiling and uncoiling like smoke with intention. The stone of the tower itself had turned black, the same diseased corruption Selene had seen in the courtyard chasm, but spreading faster, consuming 6 feet of wall every second. "It's awake," Oladorian said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice shook. "The Umbra is fully awake." As if in response to his words, the darkness above the tower condensed, forming a shape that was almost humanoid, but wrong in every proportion, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in directions that defied anatomy. Where its face should have been was only a void so absolute it seemed to pull light into itself and devour it. And it was looking directly at Selene. The silver veins on her arm blazed with sudden heat, and she understood with horrifying clarity the Umbra wasn't just awake. It was hunting, and her defiant life force had marked her as prey. The previous brides reinforced the cage, Aladorian said, power beginning to gather around his hands, the symbols on his arms igniting. But you, Selene, you rattled the bars. And now the prisoner wants out, and it wants you as its first meal in 300 years. The shadow figure took a step toward them across empty air, and where its foot touched, reality itself seemed to gray and crack. How do we stop it? Selene demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady as the burning in her arms spread to her chest, her throat, threatening to consume her from within. Aladorian's expression was bleak as he raised his hands toward the approaching darkness. I don't know if we can. The Umbra shrieked, a sound like 1,000 voices crying out in despair simultaneously, and descended upon the castle like a wave of annihilation made manifest. Its void face fixed on the defiant girl who had broken a pattern 3 centuries old and woken the ancient terror from its forced slumber. Aladorian's power erupted from his hands in torrents of silver-blue energy, crashing against the descending Umbra like waves against a cliff face. The impact shook the entire castle, sending cracks spider-webbing through the battlements. But the darkness didn't retreat. It absorbed the energy, grew larger, its void face stretching wider in what might have been a smile. The throne room, Aladorian gasped, sweat already beading his brow from the effort. There's something you need to see. Run. They fled through corridors that were blackening at the edges, the corruption racing along the walls like living ink. Servants scattered before them, their screams echoing as the temperature plummeted and frost formed on every surface. Behind them, the Umbra flowed through the castle like water finding cracks, inevitable and patient. The throne room's great doors hung open. Aladorian pulled Selene inside and slammed them shut, pressing his bleeding palms against the wood. Symbols blazed to life, creating a temporary barrier, but the doors were already beginning to darken. Listen to me, he said urgently, pulling her toward the throne. Behind it, carved into the obsidian stone itself, was text in a language so old it seemed to writhe before her eyes. I didn't tell you everything. There is a second part to the prophecy. The doors groaned. Darkness seeped through the cracks like smoke. The brides were never meant to be the permanent solution, Aladorian continued, his words tumbling out in desperate haste. They were delays. Postponements. The prophecy states that the Umbra can only be truly vanquished, not contained, but destroyed, if the binding ritual is performed willingly through choice and light, not fear. Selene stared at the ancient text, at the symbols that seemed to burn themselves into her vision. What does that mean? Every bride before you came in resignation, in acceptance of fate. Their choice was real, but it was born from surrender. His hands gripped her shoulders, his blood-red eyes blazing with intensity. But you, Selene, you came in fury. In defiance. You chose not because you accepted death, but because you refused to let your sister face it. That's different. The doors exploded inward in a shower of splinters. The Umbra poured into the throne room like a flood of liquid night, rising from the floor, dripping from the ceiling, consuming everything. The temperature dropped so rapidly that Selene's breath turned to ice crystals in the air. The torches guttered and died, leaving only the faint glow from Aladorian symbols and the silver veins burning beneath her skin. There's a temple, Aladorian shouted over the Umbra's chorus of despairing voices. Beneath the castle. The original binding site. If we can reach it, if you choose willingly, not out of resignation but out of light, out of hope, the prophecy says the bond will become a weapon instead of a cage. And if it doesn't work? The Umbra coalesced before them, its impossible form towering to the vaulted ceiling, its void face splitting open to reveal row upon row of darkness so absolute it hurt to perceive. "Then we die," Aladorian said simply. "And the Umbra consumes the realm." He grabbed her hand, the one marked with their blood bond, and ran toward a section of wall behind the throne. He slammed his palm against it and a hidden passage opened, revealing stairs descending into absolute darkness. They plunged downward as the Umbra shrieked behind them, its rage shaking the foundations of the ancient castle. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling deeper into the mountain's heart. The air grew thick, oppressive, filled with whispers and languages that predated human speech. Finally, they stumbled into a vast underground chamber. A temple, just as Aladorian had said, but one carved from living rock millennia ago. At its center stood an altar of white stone, the only light-colored thing in the entire space, covered in the same symbols that marked Aladorian's arms. Around it, a circle of ancient script glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And above them, pouring down the stairs like a waterfall of annihilation, came the Umbra. It filled the temple in seconds, rising from the floor, pressing down from the ceiling, a suffocating darkness that swallowed all light, all warmth, all hope. Selene felt it reaching for her, felt tendrils of void wrapping around her legs, her waist, her throat, drawn to the defiant fire of her life force like a moth to flame. Aladorian pulled her toward the altar, his own strength flagging as the Umbra drained the warmth from his immortal body. "The choice must be yours," he said, his voice barely audible over the Umbra's hungry chorus. "I cannot compel you, cannot force you. You must choose to bind yourself to me willingly, fully, with light and hope instead of fear and resignation. Only then." The Umbra struck, and Aladorian's words dissolved into a scream as darkness pierced through his chest like a spear of frozen void. Aladorian collapsed to his knees, the void spear protruding from his chest like a lance of absolute nothingness. Blood, almost black in the darkness, spilled from the wound, and through their bond, Selene felt his life force guttering like a candle in a hurricane. The Umbra hissed in the language of despair, a sound that carried the weight of every fear, every loss, every moment of hopelessness that had ever existed. It coiled around them both now, savoring its victory, feeding on Aladorian's fading essence while reaching for Selene with hunger that had been starved for 3 centuries. "No," Selene whispered, dropping to her knees beside Aladorian. His eyes were dimming, the vivid crimson fading to rust, and she could feel through the bond that he had minutes left. Maybe less. The Umbra's tendrils wrapped tighter around her throat, her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Cold invaded her body, numbing her fingers, her arms, creeping toward her heart. The silver veins beneath her skin began to turn black as the corruption started to consume her from within. And in that moment of absolute darkness, Selene understood. The previous brides had come resigned to death. They had chosen sacrifice, yes, but from a place of surrender. Their light had been the pale, flickering glow of acceptance. But Selene had never surrendered to anything in her life. She thought of Alara, safe at home because Selene had refused to let fate claim her. She thought of the 23 women in their marble alcoves, heroes whose names would never be sung. She thought of Aladorian, 347 years spent as a solitary guardian, bearing hatred and fear so others could live in ignorant peace. And she thought of the choice before her now, not resignation, but defiance. Not acceptance of death, but a violent, furious insistence on life. "I choose this," Selene said, her voice strangled but clear. She grabbed Aladorian's hand, pressing their joined palms against the white stone altar. "Not because I surrender. Not because I accept fate. But because I refuse to let this darkness win." The Umbra shrieked, sensing what was coming, trying to pull her away from the altar. I choose you, Selene continued, her voice growing stronger, the fire that had always burned in her core blazing brighter against the invading cold. I choose to stand with you. I choose to fight. I choose light not as an escape from darkness, but as a weapon against it. She pressed her free hand to Aladorian's chest, over his heart, over the void spear that was killing him. I choose hope. I choose us. I choose willingly, freely, with every burning piece of my defiant soul. The altar erupted. Light, pure, blinding white light, exploded from where their joined hands touched the stone. It poured through Selene's veins, turning the corrupted black back to silver, back to gold, blazing like liquid sunlight beneath her skin. The light flooded into Aladorian through their bond, and his dimming eyes suddenly blazed crimson bright, brighter than she'd ever seen them. The void spear in his chest began to dissolve, unable to exist in the presence of light born not from resignation, but from choice, from defiance, from love forged in the fires of shared purpose. The Umbra screamed. It was a sound of pure despair, the death cry of something that had existed since before light and now faced annihilation by the very force it had sought to consume. The willing bond, freely chosen, blazing with hope and defiance, created a counterforce it could not assimilate, could not corrupt, could not touch. The light spread from Selene and Aladorian in waves, each one pushing the darkness back. The Umbra tried to retreat, to flee up the stairs and escape, but the light was faster, relentless, pursuing it into every crack and crevice where it tried to hide. Where light and shadow met, the Umbra didn't just retreat, it consumed itself, unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart thread by thread. Its form fractured, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces of void that shrieked in discordant harmony as the ancient curse turned inward, devouring its own essence in a desperate, futile attempt to escape the light. Then, with a final wail that echoed through dimensions Selene couldn't name, the Umbra vanished. Not sealed. Not contained. Gone. The light faded gradually, leaving Selene and Aladorian kneeling at the altar, hands still joined, breathing hard. The temple was silent for the first time in millennia, a silence not of menace but of peace. Aladorian's chest wound had vanished entirely. The symbols on his arms had faded to faint silver scars that no longer burned. And when he looked at Selene, his eyes held something she'd never seen in them before: freedom. "It's over," he whispered, wonder in his voice. 347 years, and it's finally over. Selene felt it too, the absence where the Umbra's presence had been a constant weight she hadn't fully recognized until it disappeared. Through the bond, she felt Aladorian's immortal life force, no longer being drained, no longer shackled to an endless cycle of containment. "The brides," she said softly. "They're free too, aren't they? Their essences trapped in the binding." Released, Aladorian confirmed, standing and pulling her up with him. Return to whatever peace awaited them beyond. They climbed the stairs together, hand in hand, and emerged into a castle transformed. Sunlight poured through windows that had never seen true daylight, the oppressive shadows banished. Servants were emerging cautiously from hiding, staring in wonder at walls that had turned from black stone to warm gray granite. In the weeks that followed, word spread across the realm. The Vampire King had been freed from his curse. The blood moon call would never sound again. And standing beside him, not as a bride or a sacrifice, but as an equal, was the woman who had broken a 300-year pattern with her defiance and saved a kingdom with her choice. Selene and Aladorian stood on the battlements at sunset, looking out over lands that would no longer live in fear of the annual call, of vanished daughters, of darkness rising. "Queen Selene," Aladorian said, testing the title with a slight smile, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "The court will never recover from the scandal." "Good," Selene replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Let them talk. We have better things to do than worry about scandals. Such as rewriting history." honoring the brides properly, building a kingdom based on truth instead of fear. She looked up at him. Think you can handle that, Sentinel? With you beside me? His hand found hers, their matching scars gleaming in the fading light. I think I can handle anything. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the Blackfang Castle stood free, its king and queen ready to usher in an age where choice triumphed over fate, where light conquered darkness, and where love born from defiance proved stronger than any ancient curse. Did Selene and Aladorian's story capture your heart? If you loved watching defiance turn into devotion and a villain transform into a hero, subscribe now for more epic vampire tales. Thank you for watching.